After a night and full day of rest from her fight with Rannick, Ainslie went into the crowded great hall for a special feast. Thankfully, the soreness and bruising had faded, and she walked with ease. For the special evening, Dougal's wife Fiona gave Ainslie a silken over-tunic for the feast the Lord of the Isles hosted in honor of her and Colin. Stepping inside the great door, she smoothed her hand down the front of the garment. She wanted to look her best this evening, and with the Viking dress she felt more like a princess than a warrior. A maid styled her hair with a series of braids intertwined with glass beads. A crown of intricately twisted tin, shaped with Celtic knots, held more glass beads, and pearls sat across her upper forehead. She patted the back of her hair to ensure it was in place. Multiple bracelets, borrowed and worn at Fiona's insistence, clinked and flickered in the candlelight. Her brother's deep voice rumbled behind her. "You are like a Valkyrie princess, warrior, and queen, all wrapped in one." Colin wrapped his arm around her, hugging her, and she winced. Seemed not all the soreness had faded. "And I'll gut that damned Rannick for hurting you. He should have pulled back before a strike would hurt. It was a fight to disarm only." Ainslie turned, patting his shoulder. The Iona stones in the brooch of Lorne winked in the candlelight. "You will not. It was a fair fight, and I goaded him anyway." Colin laughed. "I'm certain you did, the same way you goaded John and me time and again." "'Tis still no excuse." Ainslie stared at the candles that blurred as she recalled Rannick's visit to her room, his quiet declaration, another vow to her. Guilt ate at her. She'd used his weakness to win the fight. Underhanded but strategically better than his tactic, to not fight at all. Sometimes winning wasn't everything. She blinked and the candles came into view. "I likely owe him an apology." Colin made a huffing sound. She glanced at him and almost grinned at his raised eyebrows. She'd shocked him. "He had an oath not to hurt women, something about his da. I forced him to break it by egging him on. I likely deserved a good whack or two." Colin frowned. Still, a good whack doesn't bruise like that. The very person they discussed approached with an older woman on his arm. She was tall like Rannick, but had blonde hair with silver streaks that reminded Ainslie of flowing white caps of ocean waves. She moved gracefully, and her expression glowed brightly when she glanced at Rannick. When he reached Colin and her, she still gazed at Rannick when he spoke. "Ainslie and Colin MacDougall, I'd like you to meet my mother Astrid." Ainslie grinned as she spoke. "Astrid, it means beautiful and loved." Astrid nodded as she peered at Colin, then Ainslie. "I am happy to meet the warrior woman who has helped heal an old part of my son's heart. I am pleased his grudge against his father is over." She glanced at Rannick, then back at Ainslie. "It was a long time coming, but worth the wait since it was you who healed him." Rannick glanced down, and Ainslie spotted a blush on his neck. Astrid took Ainslie's hands into her own and stared into her eyes. Astrid's eyes traveled over her face and hair. Her hands warmed in Ainslie's. Astrid's eyes were the same ice blue as Rannick's, and Ainslie found she couldn't look away if she tried. Astrid patted her hands and placed them in Rannick's. She closed her eyes and murmured something that Ainslie could not hear. She stared fondly at her son. "She's a strong spirit with a kind heart. A warrior for the children is the right name for her, my son. I am happy for you." She turned and walked to the dais to speak with Fiona and Dougal MacDougall. Rannick pulled something from his pouch, holding it in his hand. "Ainslie, I have a gift, a token of my regret for hurting you. I shouldn't have lost myself." Ainslie smiled, remembering the market the previous day. "I thought a woman of beauty needed no decoration." Rannick's cheeks flushed. "Ah, her wit is as sharp as a blade. True." Rannick's cheeks flushed. "Ah, her wit is as sharp as a blade. True. A woman's true worth is not in her appearance, but in the hidden person of her heart, where her imperishable beauty lies." He paused, gazing at her. Could he see her hidden person, the individual she was, a hardened warrior and a vulnerable woman? Glancing at his hands, he broke the connection. "But for you, I wish to give you this. Please turn and I will place it on you." She turned as Rannick placed a necklace around her neck, his fingers brushing her when he closed the clasp, sending shivers down her neck. She glanced down. It was the necklace from the previous day, the one she admired in the market. Silver beads on strands draped in loops connected at the center by a large silver locket twinkled in the candlelight. His hands rested on her shoulders as he whispered in her ear. Please forgive me. Ainslie turned, gazing at him over her shoulder. Their faces were close, breaths mingling. I forgive you. Colin grumbled next to Ainslie, who shot her brother a dry expression. Rannick took Ainslie's hands and placed one on his arm. Allow me to lead you to the dais. Dougal has insisted you both dine as honored guests tonight. Dougal was all too happy to see his guests again. Standing, he hugged Ainslie. Ah, the warrior woman, hopefully you have healed well. Ainslie nodded, and Dougal moved on to Colin with a bear hug and patted him on the back. Colin, please sit beside me. We have much to discuss. Everyone settled in their seats, Colin to Dougal's right, Ainslie to Fiona's left as she sat beside her husband. Rannick sat to her left and his mother next to him. Dougal banged his metal chalice on the table, and everyone in the great hall quieted. "'Tis with great pleasure I honor our guests and distant relatives, Colin and Ainslie MacDougall." He raised his cup for a toast. "To the warrior woman and her brother." Everyone raised their cups, and a cheer went through the hall. Dougal sat as Fiona signaled the servers to bring in the platters of food. Astrid leaned over Rannick, speaking to Ainslie. "I want to hear about Atar, the boy with the leg that is short no longer." Ainslie set her cup down as Rannick filled their shared trencher with food. She turned to his mother. "It was really nothing, only extra leather to build up the shoe of his shorter leg. I saw him this morning and he walked easily." Astrid smiled widely at her. Rannick leaned over, speaking to his mother. "She's being modest. You should have seen the boy run. He said he had never sprinted so fast or smoothly in all his life. Claimed it was like a long ship gliding in the ocean." Rannick glanced at Ainslie, a grin on his face. He took her hand in his and kissed the back. He cried tears of joy. Astrid beamed and nodded. "He will be loyal, Rannick, now that you have given him the gift of walking easier. He will serve you well the rest of his life." Rannick squeezed her hand and set it down as Ainslie studied their trencher. Rannick had piled it high with various foods. There was roast lamb, salted fish, and fresh root vegetables on the plate, and plenty of fresh bread sat in a bowl in front of her. He was already slicing the meat and placing the tenderest pieces on her side. She speared the lamb, put it on her tongue, and it melted in her mouth. Colin spoke to Dougal from the other side of Fiona. They spoke low, but if Ainslie focused, she could easily pick out her brother's deep voice. Dougal asked about the stones and Fae, and Colin quietly responded. Ainslie puzzled over the Fae fables, both so similar yet so different. One with an ending and one without. What did it mean? Was there no ending for Bree, or did the Fae not want Colin to know Bree may die? Then there was hers, one not from the book, but from her parents. The female died in that one, but Ainslie knew from Colin and John's experiences with the fables that they didn't come out exactly as told. The actions and conclusions were personifications of the truth. Having both had to mean something. But what? Rannick glanced at her, tilting his head as he did. "Is your side still paining you, Ainslie?" She smirked and took a bite of her food. "Would it bother you if I said yes?" He huffed and turned away. He was still angry with himself for losing control during their fight, likely upset with the fact Dougal's greatest warrior had lost. He fisted his hands and heaved another sigh. He beat himself up over his concern for hurting her. She felt guilty for teasing him and should put him out of his misery. She set her knife down and took his hand in hers. "I am truly fine. A little bruised, but nothing I haven't had before." She looked down. "I think it made Colin happy to know someone finally landed me on my ass." Rannick patted her hands. "You must tell me if you hurt, then I can take you to your room. Make sure you rest." Ainslie waved over the room. "I would much rather be here where the party is." Rannick gave her a side glance. "Party?" Ainslie took her hands away and waved in front of them. "The feast. This is a party." Rannick's gaze traveled the room, then he grunted. The serving woman brought in a fresh fruit dessert and a little honey on buttered bread, setting a platter before them. Ainslie ate a fruit as she studied Rannick's profile. "Tell me about the vow, the one about your father." Rannick sat up and turned to look at his mother by his side. She spoke with Gunnar, their heads bent close. He studied them for a moment. Ainslie stared at Rannick and followed his focus, moving to his mother, wondering what Rannick thought. Gunnar bent his head to Astrid's ear, only to have her blush and look away. She peeked at him from under her lashes. A person might miss the flirting if they weren't specifically watching, but both flirted. Her eyes returned to Rannick. He exhaled, and she hoped he would approve of the courtship. Gunnar seemed to be a good man and a better warrior. Rannick took a handful of nuts, popped one in his mouth, and chewed. Ainslie tapped his arm. The vow. Rannick glanced back at her. It is nothing you need to concern yourself with. Ainslie took his left hand in hers and faced him. I wish to know. I want to understand. He removed his hand and took a long pull on his ale. He stared into the mug and then set it down with a thump. He dumped the nuts on the trencher and spoke in a low voice. My father was one of Dougal's greatest warriors and a good friend. My father trained Dougal in his youth before his dad's death, and he took over as Lord of the Isles. Fiona and my mother are best friends. Astrid is a mother figure to Fiona, who lost hers at a young age. He sighed. My father loved my mother deeply. He courted her for a full year before her father relented and allowed the match. For a time, they were happy. He peered at his mother, and Ainslie's eyes followed. Astrid turned her head to the side as Gunnar whispered in her ear. She put her hand on his chest, and he raised his head and gazed at her with longing. Astrid returned the look and grinned. Ainslie turned to Rannick, and he smiled. The elder couple seemed happy, and she bet it was long overdue. He fisted his hands as he spoke again. It was the drink that got him angry. He raided for Dougal and was away often when I was young. Another's husband, who was injured and couldn't raid, took to helping her with chores and supplying food from his hunts. He took another long drink of his ale. My father's drunkenness and jealousy led to his anger, which kept coming out of his fists. He glanced at his mother. My mother's a healer and weathered the bruises well, but one night he was hard on her and knocked her out. I just started training with the sword, and we argued. I thought he'd killed her. In my stupid youth, I killed him to avenge her death. Her heart went out to him, and Ainslie placed her hand on his arm. You were young and defending your ma. It took a lot of courage to stand up to your dad like that. What a difficult thing to deal with as a young man, to face off with your father to protect your mother. A fight for both the people you love most in the world, yet forced to pick one over the other. He laughed bitterly. That's what Dougal said, declared me innocent of wrongdoing, and demanded I move in with the warriors training in his castle. He said I would make a great warrior one day. He stared ahead. That was when I vowed never to hurt a woman. I pledged to defend them. Ainslie rubbed his hand as she still held it. And you have, Rannick. He tightly fisted the hand she held. My anger at my father cost him his life. I should have better control over my fighting, not permit the bloodlust to control me. Ainslie smoothed her hand over his firm fist, and he relaxed it a little. She understood his warrior's heart, the desire to control the fierce energy within him that wanted to wage war, but still needed to be gentle with his friends and family, the people he loved deeply. Maybe if she explained how she saw the bloodlust, he might understand the balance between the two. She continued to caress his fist as she whispered, Bloodlust is something every fighter has, Rannick, even women. He stared at her hand, gently stroking his, and he relaxed a little more. Her fingers trailed along his knuckles. Fighting comes in many forms, not just the sword a warrior wields, but a mother's fight to bring an infant into the world, a husband's fight to hunt for food for his family, a warrior's fight to defend his land. She opened his fingers and lightly brushed hers along his palm, from his fingertips to his wrist and back. A child's fight to survive in a hard world. She slowly traced the lines on his hand. Using the bloodlust for the right reasons and causes is the art of being a great warrior. Rannick glanced at his hand, then her face. His free hand came to her cheek and caressed it. He used his thumb to tilt her head till their eyes connected. Warrior for the children, woman of war, is your bloodlust only for the children? Ainslie gazed into Rannick's bright blue eyes and became lost. She spoke before she thought. Everyone. I fight for everyone. Who does your bloodlust fight for, Rannick? He leaned toward her and their breaths mingled. I fight for many things. He licked his lips and spoke softly. But tonight I use it to pursue the woman I love. He brushed his lips on hers, and they paused for a moment, a breath, and they stared into each other's eyes. The room erupted in a roar of cheers as they broke apart. Ainslie dropped her head, her face heating. They'd forgotten where they were. Dougal slammed his cup on the table. Rannick, my man, seducing a woman at my feast table and in front of her brother. You grow bolder by the day. Colin growled next to Dougal. Ainslie peeked at her brother, who glared at her. Colin smiled, nodded, and spoke loudly for all to hear. Ainslie is a rare woman, a bright spirit. She has a will of her own, and I permit her to pursue her heart. I desire her to find true love as I have. Dougal turned to Colin. Aye, and as I vowed before, we shall find your true love. I suspect my messengers will return soon, and when they do, we shall go raiding and bring her back. Ainslie shifted in her seat, wincing from her injury. Colin turned to her. Ainslie, you should rest from your injury. She glared daggers at him. I am fine, brother. Her sharp response brought a smirk to Colin's face. Rannick spoke to Colin. I shall see her to her chamber. He turned to her and rose, helping her up. Good night, all. He glanced at her, smiling. Good party and good rest. Colin watched them leave, Rannick carefully escorting his sister from the hall. Her gaze was only for Rannick. Love grew between them for all to see if only one looked. He turned and sat staring into his mug. He hoped what he saw in Ainslie was love, and then again he hoped not. Ainslie and love would make traveling back to their time that much harder. I forgive you.